America's place as a world power, its position as a superpower with military bases across the globe, its economy that dominates international trade, its cultural influence that reaches every corner of the planet. All of this began with a treaty signed in Paris in 1763. When France surrendered its claims to North America at the end of the French and Indian War, when French flags came down from forts stretching from Canada to Louisiana, when French soldiers sailed back to Europe and left the continent to British control, the stage was set for American dominance over 2 centuries later. This was not obvious at the time. Nobody in 1763 looked at the 13 colonies and saw a future superpower. They saw a collection of agricultural settlements on the edge of a wilderness, valuable to Britain for trade but hardly world-changing.
But the removal of France and later other European powers from North America gave the future United States something that no other nation in history had enjoyed: an entire continent to expand into without facing serious European military opposition.
That geographic advantage, that freedom from nearby powerful rivals, that ability to grow and develop without constantly fighting European armies on American soil, turned the United States from a collection of coastal colonies into a continental power and eventually into the dominant force in global affairs. America's rise to world power started in 1763, when European rivals were removed from North America, and everything that followed, from westward expansion to economic growth to military might, flowed from that fundamental fact. Before 1763, North America was crowded with European imperial powers competing for territory and influence. France controlled Canada and claimed the entire interior of the continent from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Spain held Florida and claimed territories west of the Mississippi, including Texas and the Southwest all the way to California. Britain had the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, plus some Caribbean islands. These empires constantly competed, formed alliances with Indian tribes, built forts, fought wars, and jockeyed for advantage. The British colonies were hemmed in on all sides. French power blocked westward expansion. Spanish power controlled the Gulf Coast and the Southwest. The Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic, which was good for trade but also meant Britain controlled colonial commerce. The colonists lived in a world where European great power politics directly affected their lives, where wars in Europe automatically became wars in America, where expansion was limited by European military power. The French and Indian War changed everything by eliminating France as a North American power. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced France to give up Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi River to Britain. France ceded Louisiana, its territory west of the Mississippi, to Spain to keep it out of British hands. In one stroke, France went from claiming half the continent to owning nothing except 2 tiny fishing islands off Newfoundland. The great French arc of territory from Quebec to New Orleans was broken. The forts were now British. The trade routes were now British. The alliances with Indian tribes were disrupted. French military power, which had threatened British colonies for generations, was simply gone. This created an unprecedented opportunity for expansion. British colonists, and later American citizens after independence, could now push westward into territories that had been controlled by France. The Ohio Valley, which had been the flashpoint that started the war, was now open to British and American settlement. The Great Lakes region was now accessible. The Mississippi River became a highway for American commerce rather than a French-controlled barrier. When the United States achieved independence in 1783, it inherited from Britain all the territory from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. This was an enormous land area, far larger than the original 13 colonies, and it was available for settlement because France no longer controlled it. The removal of France meant the United States faced no major European military power on its borders except for British Canada to the north and Spanish territories to the south and west. Canada was large, but thinly populated and not aggressively expansionist. Spain's American empire was weakening and would eventually collapse in the early 19th century. This meant the United States could expand westward and develop its economy without constantly fighting European armies the way European nations had to fight each other. A French farmer or German merchant lived in a world where powerful neighbors were always a potential threat, where wars could devastate your region, where military power was necessary for survival. An American settler moving into Ohio or Kentucky faced dangers from Indian tribes resisting encroachment on their lands, but did not face French or Spanish armies trying to stop American expansion. The absence of European military power in the interior of North America was a gift that allowed the United States to grow in ways that would have been impossible if France had remained a major continental power. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States overnight. The United States bought from France approximately 828,000 square miles of territory stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This purchase was only possible because France no longer had a strong position in North America. Napoleon had briefly reacquired Louisiana from Spain in 1800, but he could not defend it or develop it, especially after losing Haiti to a slave rebellion and facing renewed war with Britain. He sold Louisiana to the United States for about $15 million, one of the greatest bargains in history. If France had maintained its North American empire after 1763, if French power had remained strong in the interior, there would have been no Louisiana Purchase, because France would not have given up such valuable territory. The United States acquired this vast region because France had been kicked out of North America in the French and Indian War and never really recovered its position. The acquisition of Louisiana opened the entire western half of the continent to American expansion. Lewis and Clark's expedition from 1804 to 1806 explored the Louisiana Territory and beyond, reaching the Pacific Ocean and mapping routes for future expansion. American settlers poured into the new territories. States were carved from the Louisiana Purchase, including Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, parts of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and Oklahoma. Each of these states added land, resources, and eventually population to the United States. Each made the country larger, richer, and more powerful. And all of it was possible because France had been removed from North America. In 1763, the expansion continued. Florida was acquired from Spain in 1819 through the Adams-Onis Treaty. Spain was weak and could not hold Florida against American pressure. Texas was annexed in 1845 after American settlers in Mexican Texas rebelled and established an independent republic that then joined the United States. The Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848 resulted in the United States acquiring California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Oregon Treaty with Britain in 1846 established American control over the Pacific Northwest. By 1848, the United States stretched from Atlantic to Pacific, a continental nation controlling the entire width of North America between Canada and Mexico. This expansion happened in less than a century and created the geographic foundation for American power. None of this expansion would have been possible if France had remained a major power in North America after 1763. If French forts still controlled the Mississippi and the Great Lakes, if French armies still garrisoned the interior, if French alliances with Indian tribes still blocked westward movement, American expansion would have stopped at the Appalachian Mountains, or perhaps the Ohio River. The United States would have remained a relatively small nation, confined to the eastern seaboard, and perhaps some adjacent territories. The demographic and economic growth that came from westward expansion would not have happened. The resources that fueled American industrialization would not have been accessible. The United States would have been just another medium-sized nation competing in a crowded world, not a continental power with vast territory and resources. The geographic advantages gained from removing European rivals were enormous. The United States had access to incredible natural resources across a huge territory. Rich, agricultural land in the Midwest could feed a growing population and produce surplus for export. Forests provided timber for construction and fuel. Coal and iron deposits fueled industrial development. Gold and silver discoveries attracted settlers and capital. Oil fields discovered in the late 19th century powered the industrial economy. The country had navigable rivers for internal transport, including the Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri river systems. It had ports on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, allowing trade with Europe and Asia. It had enough land that population growth could be accommodated through expansion rather than through the kind of crowding that created social tensions in European countries. More importantly, the United States had security, separated from European powers by vast oceans, with weak neighbors to the north and south, and with no European powers controlling territories in the continental interior. The United States did not need to maintain a large standing army. European nations had to spend huge portions of their budgets on military forces because they constantly threatened each other. France needed a big army because Germany was next door. Germany needed a big army because France and Russia were neighbors. Britain needed the world's largest navy to protect its island and its empire. These military expenses drained resources that could have been invested in economic development. The United States, by contrast, could afford to keep a small peacetime military through most of the 19th century. Money that European nations spent on armies and navies could be invested in roads, canals, railroads, factories, and schools. The economic advantages of security, of not facing nearby powerful enemies, were incalculable. This security allowed the United States to focus on internal development rather than external threats. The 19th century in America was primarily about settling the West, building infrastructure, developing industry, and dealing with internal issues like slavery and sectional conflict. These were serious challenges, and the Civil War from 1861 to 1865 nearly tore the country apart. But these were internal issues. The United States was not invaded by European armies during the Civil War, though both Britain and France considered recognizing the Confederacy. After the Civil War, the reunited nation could focus on reconstruction, industrialization, and continued westward expansion without worrying about European military threats. European nations during the same period were fighting each other in wars like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, maintaining huge armies, forming complex alliance systems, and preparing for the catastrophic world wars that would devastate Europe in the 20th century. By 1900, the United States had become an industrial powerhouse. American factories produced more steel than Britain. American railroads connected the continent. American cities grew into major metropolises. American agriculture fed not just the domestic population, but provided exports to the world. The American economy, fueled by the resources and markets of a continental nation, was becoming the largest in the world. This economic power translated into political and eventually military power. The Spanish-American War in 1898 announced American arrival as an imperial power, with the United States acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines from Spain, and effectively controlling Cuba. The construction of the Panama Canal, completed in 1914, demonstrated American engineering capability and strategic vision, giving the United States control over the vital link between Atlantic and Pacific. World War I turned the United States into a decisive factor in global affairs. When the United States entered the war in 1917, American industrial capacity, financial resources, and eventually military forces tipped the balance against Germany. American loans financed the Allied war effort. American factories produced weapons and supplies. American troops arrived in France in large numbers in 1918, providing fresh forces when European armies were exhausted. The war demonstrated that the United States had become powerful enough to determine the outcome of European conflicts. After the war, the United States retreated into isolationism, refusing to join the League of Nations and trying to avoid European entanglements. But the demonstration of American power was unmistakable. The United States was no longer a peripheral nation. It was a major power whose decisions affected the world. World War II confirmed American dominance. The United States became what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, producing vast quantities of weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft for the Allied cause. American industry, operating across a secure continental territory far from enemy bombers, vastly outproduced the Axis powers. American resources, drawn from the continent conquered and settled in the previous century, fueled the war effort. American military forces fought in Europe, North Africa, and across the Pacific. By 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were the only powers capable of projecting force globally. The United States emerged from the war with an intact and expanded industrial base, a powerful military, and nuclear weapons. The foundation for Cold War superpower status had been built. The Cold War from 1945 to 1991 saw the United States as one of two superpowers competing globally. American military bases circled the world. American economic influence shaped international trade and development. American culture spread through movies, music, and television. The United States had the wealth and power to sustain a decades-long competition with the Soviet Union, maintaining huge military forces, fighting proxy wars, funding allies, and building weapons systems that pushed the boundaries of technology. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the United States stood as the sole superpower, the most powerful nation in history with unmatched military capabilities, the world's largest economy, and global cultural influence. This entire trajectory, from colonial settlements in 1763 to sole superpower in 1991 and beyond, traces back to the removal of European rivals from North America. The geographic foundation was laid when France lost the French and Indian War and gave up its North American territories. That loss opened the continent to American expansion. The expansion provided land, resources, and security. Those advantages allowed rapid economic development without the burden of constant military threats. Economic power enabled military power when needed. Military power combined with economic and cultural influence created superpower status. Each step built on the previous one, and the first step was removing France from North America in 1763. Consider the alternative. If France had won the French and Indian War, or if France had been allowed to keep significant North American territories in the peace settlement, the United States would have been confined to a much smaller territory, perhaps just the Atlantic seaboard, and maybe some adjacent regions. American population growth would have been constrained by lack of room for expansion. American agriculture would have been limited. American resources would have been a fraction of what they actually became. American industry would have developed more slowly, with access to fewer raw materials and smaller markets. The security advantages would have been lost, with the United States facing a powerful French Empire on its western border, requiring large military expenditures and preventing the focus on internal development that actually occurred. The United States would have remained a secondary power, important regionally but not globally dominant. There might be no Louisiana Purchase, no westward expansion, no California gold rush, no transcontinental railroad, no industrial revolution on the scale that actually happened, no emergence as a world power. The world today would look completely different. If the United States had remained a small nation confined to the eastern seaboard, some other power would have dominated the 20th century. Perhaps Germany if it had won World War I. Perhaps the Soviet Union if there had been no powerful United States to oppose Soviet expansion after World War II. Perhaps no single superpower at all, but a multipolar world of several roughly equal powers competing for influence. American cultural influence would be minimal. English might not be the global language. American movies, music, technology companies, and fast food chains would not dominate global culture. The world would be organized along different lines, with different power centers, different international institutions, different patterns of trade and influence. But none of that happened because France lost the French and Indian War. British victory in that war removed France from North America and set in motion the chain of events that created American continental dominance and eventually global superpower status. The connection might not be obvious. A war that ended in 1763 seems disconnected from American power in the 21st century, but trace the causal chains and the connection becomes clear. No French removal in 1763 means no American westward expansion. No westward expansion means no continental nation. No continental nation means no resource base for industrial development. No industrial base means no economic power. No economic power means no military superpower status. No superpower status means no American dominance of global affairs. Each link in the chain depends on the previous one, and the first link was forged when France surrendered Canada and Louisiana in the Treaty of Paris. When you see American military forces operating around the world, when you buy products from American companies, when you watch American movies, or listen to American music, when you use American technology, or speak English as a global language, you are seeing the consequences of decisions made in 1763. The French and Indian War was not just another colonial conflict. It was the war that determined whether North America would be French or British, and that determination set in motion everything that followed. Britain won, so English became the dominant language, and British political traditions shaped American institutions. But more fundamentally, British victory removed France from the continent and opened it to expansion by the future United States. That expansion created the geographic and economic foundation for American power. Everything built on that foundation, from 19th century industrialization to 20th century superpower status to 21st century global dominance. America's place as a world power started when European rivals were removed from North America in 1763, and that removal was the result of British military victory in the French and Indian War. The world you live in today, dominated by American economic, military, and cultural power, was made possible by battles fought over 250 years ago in the forests of North America and on the heights above Quebec. The French and Indian War was not just history, it was the beginning of the American century, and its consequences still shape the world every single day.